Okay, folks, we're going to be starting our next panel, so please make your way to your tables. Okay, it is 10:30, so we're going to start our next panel, which is Artificial Intelligence, Cybersecurity, and the Impact on Data Sovereignty. So we have a very diverse group of individuals here who will talk about this topic, so I would like to introduce myself. So I grew up in a small community called Tisto, Arizona. Anyone know where Tisto's at? Yay! So it's a very small community. I'm actually with the University of Arizona College of Medicine with Family Community Medicine. I am the director for their Circle of Indigenous Empowerment, which is our native center for disabilities as part of the Sonoran Center for Excellence in Disabilities. I've been at the U of A for quite a while. And in this topic, we chose this topic because we see the emergence of new technology. And how does that new technology impact our policies, our innovation and education? And so what does it mean to us as researchers, as educators, as students, as business people, tribal communities, tribal nations, and so forth? So this is a very appropriate topic for us to talk about. And I, as a student, have seen, our use of ChatGPT and the use of artificial intelligence when it comes to research and writing research articles and how it's being used in apps and so forth. So it's a really relevant topic for us to talk about. So what we're going to do is we're going to have two presentations, and then we're going to have discussion among the groups here. And so I will leave it to Tyson to start us off, and each of the individual folks will introduce themselves and talk about their topic for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have question and answers. Okay, Tyson?
Thank you. So I'm Tyson Winarski. I'm a patent attorney and law professor here at the ASU College of Law. I have spent about 10 years in major law firms in Washington, D.C. doing patent litigation, trademark copyright litigation. And I spent about 10 years in Silicon Valley working with one of the world's largest patent portfolios doing patent licensing. But one of my greatest pleasures, I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and I got to be friends with Farrell Sikakaku, former tribal chairman of the Hopi tribe, and helped him create Mesa Media, a nonprofit corporation dedicated to creating media in the Hopi language. And so I set up all the legal documents and created the 501c3, and then filed a lot of copyrights on calendars, Sudoku puzzles, crossword puzzles in the Hopi language. So I'm going to talk to you today about AI, language preservation, and cybersecurity, and it's crazy, but I sort of have a little background in each of those. So I did a certain amount of language preservation through Mesa Media, but my background, I started out my legal career working for Stuart Baker at Steptoe & Johnson. Stuart's the former general counsel for the National Security Agency, the intelligence agency responsible for cybersecurity. I myself have patented numerous inventions on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. And at Intellectual Ventures, I licensed one of the world's largest patent portfolios on cybersecurity. So let's talk about some happy news first. AI can do a lot to preserve native languages, native culture, and really vitalize them. It was just reported 2 days ago in NBC News how indigenous engineers are using AI to preserve their culture. In particular, there's FLAIR, the First Languages AI reality, that is generating large language models in native languages to create virtual native speakers to vitalize native languages and culture. And this has a lot of benefits. AI can do a lot to help your culture, help your language. 50% of the world's languages may become extinct or endangered by 2100. But by creating a virtual AI language system, you can create a fully fluent computer-based native speaker. With AI speech recognition and synthesis, AI can be trained to understand and generate indigenous languages, not just in writing, but audibly. And what's really important is voice cloning. It sounds horrible, but voice cloning can replicate and mimic native speakers, preserving pronunciation, preserving nuances. So you know, the different dialects you might have between, you know, different parts of a tribe, different mesas, you can preserve through AI and allow virtual assistants to speak in native languages. Sorry for the picture of Star Trek, but I'm a huge Star Trek fan. But one of the cool pieces of technology in Star Trek is the universal translator. I think it was a flash tube from a Kodak camera that Captain Kirk would hold up, but miraculously, all of these different alien species all over the universe could speak in the same language as Captain Kirk. But AI, fluent AI in a native language can do that for native speakers where now, you know, English is sort of pushed on everybody through Facebook and Instagram, and you have to, your English gets practiced and reinforced, where now AI can function as a universal translator and translate everything on your phone into your native language, and you can interact with everybody all over the world in every language in your native language, really bringing new dramatic usage to your native language. AI can function as a teacher, and AI can generate entertainment in media content, you know, important for younger generations to help, you know, really increase usage and vitality in native languages. So one other piece of this puzzle to bring this all together is bandwidth. To have AI, you need bandwidth, and that's good news for, there's good news for tribal governments in the state of Arizona. The U.S. Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration has created an initiative called Internet for All that is providing $105 million in grants for high-speed internet infrastructure to serve 5 tribal nations in the state of Arizona. They include Hopi, Navajo, Pasquayaqui, San Carlos Apache Tribe, and the White Mountain Apache Tribe. The tribal chairman, former tribal chairman Pasquayaqui, in the article in Tribal Business News, commented how this grant will enable the Pasquayaqui to connect all 69 of their government buildings, 9 tribal businesses, and through its data center, run high-speed internet to their various residential communities. So, hey, isn't this great? High-speed connectivity for tribal nations brings enormous benefits, brings economic development and growth, enhanced services for tribal members, enhanced access to education, improved access to health care. But we get into issues about data sovereignty, controlling the data security of your tribal nation. So high-speed connectivity works both ways. Well, you and your tribal governments can reach your members and reach the world, sell your products from your tribal businesses to anyone in the world. Now, anyone in the world can now have access to you, including people from, you know, hackers from North Korea, from Russia. Chinese hackers apparently have all of our cell phone data now, based on an article I saw this morning. And so this connectivity that will bring us benefits through AI also exposes your tribal nations, your governments, your businesses, your members at serious risk to these hackers from all over the world. And this is really putting your data sovereignty at stake. So let's talk about some fun, scary examples. I always feel this is the juicy part of the conversation that wakes people up. So just in this past year, we've seen some really serious cyber attacks, new kinds of attacks using AI deep fakes just in the past several months. So I don't know if you've heard of Erupt. It's this major British engineering firm. They have about 13,000 employees worldwide. They're a huge corporation. They built the Sydney Opera House. They built Manchester United Stadium in the United Kingdom. Well, anyways, the engineering group lost $25 million due to a deep fake AI attack. What they did is using social media recordings of various executives, including the chief financial officer, they created deep fake versions of all of these executives and contacted some poor mid-level financial employee. So this mid-level and financial employee is talking to on a Zoom call with all of these deep fake versions of these executives, and these executives are telling them you need to transfer 25 million out of the company to these various Hong Kong accounts, and the employee did it. You know, all of a sudden you've got these executives in front of you and they transferred this money out, and the problem was this employee was the only real human on the call. Everybody else was a deep fake AI model of this executive and these other people. Also, this past summer, a deepfake CEO, they cloned the CEO's voice to this another British company and got this employee to transfer $250,000 out of the company. And so there's real risks here for AI cybersecurity in native languages. AI can create a and preserve a native language through a large language model. But now cyber criminals can potentially also get access to that language model and start launching cyber attacks directed at you in your native language, in Hopi and Navajo and Pasquayaki. And so it's important to start educating tribal governments, tribal businesses, all of your tribal members on these cybersecurity risks, because you might find a friend of yours might call you up. Trevor might call me up and start talking to Hopi and be like, "Ty, I need $50. Can you go to Circle K and buy a gift card and send me the number?"
Can we make that 100?
You know, make sure we'll make that 100. But you need to be careful. Hey, if anybody's calling you up for money, if anybody from your government is calling you for money, or businesses, to start thinking like, hey, let's have confirm this through an in-person communication or an email or something else. But I recommend, one of the things I do for ASU, I've been tasked to start doing annual AI security trainings for faculty and staff. And so I recommend all of you talk to your tribal communities, talk to your tribal governments, and have an annual AI cybersecurity training, not just for government employees and businesses, but all tribal members, because this is a problem. We're all in this together. Another problem you need to think about is AI and indigenous knowledge. There's good news. AI can help preserve cultural traditions. Across the hall, you can see virtual examples where you can create virtual ceremonies, storytelling, other ways to maintain your culture. But this gets into issues of data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is a principle and practice that tribal governments have authority and control over the data that pertains to your culture, your members, your lands, your governance. But when you start entering in your information into an AI system under contracts, software contracts, click-wrap licensing agreements, that data might end up in the large language AI model and become public. If you use public free AI and you put in text prompts, guess what? Those text prompts become part of the AI model and public data. So if you upload your resume and be like, hey, make this sound more professional, because I'd like to work down in Tucson. No, I'll get stoned up here if I say that. But all of a sudden my resume is now in the AI model and it's public. And so you want to be careful if you use public free AI to upload any of your indigenous knowledge, your tribal stories, things you want to keep private and personal to your tribe and your community. Guess what? You just made it public. And so you want to make sure tribal governments might want to think about getting an enterprise license for AI. So ASU, I know, has a enterprise license with ChatGPT. So ASU staff and employees can use ChatGPT, and all of that information, all those text prompts, documents we upload to ChatGPT stay within ASU and do not get made public. And so I'd encourage tribal governments to look at getting an enterprise version of AI, or at least make sure you have contracts to make sure that any tribal personal knowledge that gets uploaded to AI is only available within your tribal community. And with that, thank you. That's what I have to say. Here's my contact information if you want to get a picture of that. But let's keep the conversation going, and I'll pass it off to Trevor. Thank you so much.
All right. So I'm just going to go straight into the conversation here. Thank you, Tyson, for the the great intro. And I wanted to talk about some of the challenges of dealing with cultural data in this AI environment. And I'm grateful that I have my wonderful colleague, Professor Marisa Duarte, right here next to me, who I think will have the chance to really elaborate on some of these principles. I'm not, of course, an expert in AI. I do teach intellectual property courses at ASU Law. I also teach federal Indian law. And so I'm going to try to bring those two together. Let's hit the next slide here. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit more about deepfakes and hallucinations, but specifically with cultural materials and the disparate impact that those have on our communities. And I'm going to hopefully tease out a little bit of how intellectual property can or can't help tribes as we're protecting these kinds of things. And then what additional legislation we have out there. We know that the federal government, Congress, is proposing a few new laws, the No Fakes Act and a few others. So I wanted to talk about how those may or may not be helpful to us. So for all of you who are doing research and incorporating AI into your work, which I think ends up being all of us, I think these topics are really important and really timely. Okay, so first I want to be positive for a second and say that I think indigenized AI is doing a lot of good. There are a couple of, I'm not going to show these videos, but the Lakota AI Code Camp I think is a great example of how folks are harnessing AI, using it in interesting ways to fill in gaps where we might not have access to cultural experts. So the Lakota AI Code Camp, they have a limited amount of data that they can work with, but they're using AI to kind of fill in the language gaps so that they can have samples of fluent speakers speaking. And I think that's a really interesting model. This other one, Polarctic, is one that just came across my desk maybe a few months ago. These two sisters up in the Arctic are using AI to predict how the sea ice is melting and help chart navigational paths across the Arctic for different entities, keeping them from running aground and harming people or the environment. And I think their project is really interesting and thoughtful, and they incorporate traditional knowledge into the design of the AI and also into the design of the output. So kudos to both of these folks. The ones that I'm a little bit concerned about, let's see if I can get this to advance for me. There we go. I'm concerned about digital replicas and especially how they're being utilized and mobilized in Indian country. So there's a number of court cases going on right now dealing with digital replicas. This one is an image from the Getty Images versus Stability AI litigation that's happening right now. So you can see there's the original on the left, and then on the right is kind of the AI version. And so much of Getty Images material has been ingested into AI that you can even see the logo appear on the image on the right, right? Just so much of that content. And I think about, how much of our content, how much of our lives as tribal members have been ingested into AI already, and will they be able to reproduce things like this pretty easily just by typing in our tribal name, maybe a few additional details. The image on the right here it comes from a woman named, I think it's Kitty Van Cosent. She's a designer, a Dutch designer, who decided to use the Navajo word Najoni on as her brand for her fashion line, right? And on the front page of her fashion website, she actually used this image, and an individual, I think, was running this image through a bunch of different AI detector filters and found out that this is actually just an AI creation. This image of this model right here. And you can kind of tell, right, there's a lot of different, kind of stereotypical native elements being thrown into this image. But again, another danger of having so much indigenous imagery added into these big data sets, and then people can produce something like this, call it Najoni, and people are thinking, wow, is that Navajo? Is that not? What exactly is that? All right, generative AI may have some interesting intersections with cultural appropriation. So on the positive side, we have really interesting artists like Stephen Yazzie. So he was invited by the Denver Museum to do a response video to an exhibition they did about French Orientalism and how that reflects some of the behaviors that were happening in the US. And what he did was he took these images of these French Orientalist painters up there on the top row, and he plugged them into AI with the lines of a poem from a collaborator of his, and he created this really interesting video that kind of brings these images to life and works with them and changes them and develops them. So I think I'd certainly recommend checking out this work, but I think it's an interesting use of AI, taking this kind of original cultural appropriation that these artists did back in the 1800s, and then reformatting it, indigenizing it, making it something of his own. I think we all do this, right? We step in and we grab elements of culture all around us and we indigenize them or make them our own in different ways. And I think it's interesting and something to celebrate. On the other side, we have something that I'm not sure how many of you have seen this already. This is a little series of videos called Ayana, the Navajo Flower Girl. And they were developed by a gentleman in the UK. Basically typed into AI, different images about Navajo culture. He wanted to see, a young girl that was learning about AI and wanted to create this film. So he did that and he created this whole thing, but without consulting Navajo Nation at all. He had only visited Navajo Nation once, and he created this entire 20-part series. And it has all kinds of unusual things. He tried to incorporate Navajo language into it. It comes off feeling like maybe this was produced by Navajo Nation. It's unclear. But I think the big challenge with these generative AI appropriations is that not only does it create a digital fake or a digital replica, but it also appropriates the voice of our people, right? It's almost like saying, this is what we think about AI or about green energy, which is a topic that comes up quite a bit in this series, or about all sorts of different things. But yet it's coming from the perspective of a white guy from the UK, right? So what do we do about this, right? I think that's the question. You might be asking, well, why don't we start with the training data? Let's keep that from getting into the hands of AI users or AI corporations. But as much as I believe that that's a solution, I think it is, a lot of it's already out there, right? If you look at how many institutions already hold our culture and who are willing to make it available to AI corporations, ingest it into AI, I think this is a losing battle, unfortunately. I think we should go forward and try to convince these institutions not to make this material public, but I don't know if we have that ability at this late in the game. Just looking at the numbers. We also have the law, right? We can always rely on public law to help us out. We know that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples tells us that we have not only the right to control, but also the right to develop our cultural expressions through intellectual property law. We know through the CARE principles that you all are familiar with that we have the right to access and govern and steward our Indigenous data. And we have currently at least 48, 49 tribal nations with their own laws that tell us what things they would like to be available to AI, what things they don't want out there in the world. And I want to thank Angela Riley at UCLA for compiling all of these laws. And if you haven't had the chance to look at her work, I certainly invite you to do that. All right. So I wanted to bring up this example of the Pasquayaki tribal code because I think it's particularly forward-thinking in the types of ways, the types of maneuvers that it does. And as researchers in Indian country, one of the ways we can give back to communities is by helping them develop policy that will help protect against appropriations or misuses of the research that we do, and also the research of our intellectual ancestors, right? So Pasquayaki protects a wide variety of intellectual property. I'm calling it intellectual property in air quotes. They define specifically what they want to protect. So we're talking about knowledge of remembered histories, details of cultural sites, sacred property like sounds and images, knowledge of species, knowledge of ecosystems, even biogenetic resources and DNA and information about DNA. And there's some pretty hefty penalties. If you disturb this, if you excavate it, if you desecrate it, you're responsible for covering the repair costs, right? Not just a fine, but you're gonna have to pay, in terms of a civil penalty, all the costs to restore. All right, getting to the end here. Certainly we can rely on federal rights like copyright, but it's pretty limited, right? It only protects things that are original to a particular author. It doesn't necessarily protect things that we've received through traditional knowledge or that have been passed down from generation to generation. Only the new things we add to it. It only protects the things that are in a physical object, not things that we share in terms of oral transmission, and it only protects expression. It doesn't protect histories or facts or systems, right? Those are the kinds of things that a lot of tribes want to protect. If AI does happen to ingest all of our culture, or especially our expressive culture, and then reproduce something like we saw with the Getty images, can we sue them, right? Can we get them to stop? Well, it's a little bit challenging, right? Unless there's an exact replication or something that's substantially similar, we may not be able to, right? Because the test for copyright infringement really looks at how similar the original and the AI output would be. Even if we could sue them, we could potentially get damages, but there's exceptions for nonprofit institutions, right? They aren't necessarily subject to these damage awards. And getting an injunction or a court order to stop it is really, really hard these days after the Supreme Court's decision in 2006. So we're kind of fighting an uphill battle. And I won't even get into fair use, right? That's an even more challenging area. Last but not least, I wanted to talk about some of the federal legislation in case any of you would like to advocate on the Hill for some of this, right? So there are two bills, I think there's actually 3 or 4 now, but when I made these slides, there were 2 main acts that were being proposed. One was the No AI Fraud Act, which prohibits knowingly taking somebody's unauthorized digital image and sounds and then using it without their consent. The other was this right, the No Fakes Act, which gives you a right to make positive or make replicas of images and sounds of your voice. What I want to point out is that both of the current laws that are proposed before Congress are individual laws, right? They will protect your individual identity. What they won't protect is your cultural identity, your collective identity. So I think for those of us that want to advocate in this space, if we can reach out to our Congress people, I'm not telling you you need to do this. I can't tell you to advocate for policies, right? But what I can say is that, you know, if this is something that you're interested in, tribes could benefit more from a collective protection, and that might be within their interests. All right, so I wanted to just leave that with you. Happy to talk more about this, but thank you for your attention and your help.
Hey everyone, my name is Gerty. I'm the CEO of 917 Solutions, and also Agnes, you're my sister.
Yay!
So for any of you Navajos out there, Totsoni Nishle Nakedina Bashishtin, Tanazani Dashiche do Tabaha Dashin, or actually I got that reversed. Tanazani Dashinala Tabaha Dashiche. So great to see you all here today. As the CEO of 917 Solutions, we're a company based out of the Navajo Nation, so we're operating on the reservation, and we help over 70 clients with their IT and cybersecurity services currently, and we delivered about 100 projects. So I started my company 2 years ago after leaving the comfort of corporate IT, so I've helped really large construction companies scale and grow their cybersecurity practices. So if you see buildings like the Raiders Stadium and the MSG Sphere, I've worked on those projects through the companies that I've worked for. And my primary responsibility in delivering those projects was helping them to deliver at scale. They did go over budget, but it's not my fault. And that's just a byproduct of change. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about cybersecurity and AI, especially on tribal lands. So the biggest thing that I see the problem with on the reservation, especially with the I don't want to like throw any names out there, but the Navajo Nation, work with the San Carlos tribe, is really just that the data is stored in a file cabinet, right? So they know that they want to go to the cloud. They know that they want to be more productive. They know that they want to be more proficient, but they can't. There's someone out there that needs to go and scan every single file, every single folder into the cloud, but no one's got time for that for the most part. So I think the biggest problem right now that tribes are facing really is digital transformation, learning how to scale, grow, and adopt technology. So I have a customer out in Glendale where they're building the theme parks? Mm-hmm. And so we have a few clients that are doing the construction for those theme parks. And so yesterday I went out to that job site and I was helping them set up the technology components. because my team couldn't go out to that job site to do that. And so I was talking with some of the foremen who work there, and they were like, we've never used a computer before. These men are in their 50s and their 60s, and they're just like, I am so afraid of using technology, but the company that we work for wants to be technology forward. So I don't know how to do that. Can you teach me? Is your team able to help us do that? So not only do we have to help this company be secure and use the tools that are available to them, but we also have to help them learn how to use the technology. So the construction company that we're working with is really forward and progressive, and they're like, guys, I know that you're plumbers, but the real big advantage that we have is most plumbers your age don't want to learn how to use a computer. So they're making these guys out in the field use a computer, submit everything electronically, and it's just incredible how much time it's saved and how quickly they're able to, move on to other things in their project. So I think if the tribes and reservations were to take that approach and really be progressive about adopting technology, that we could see a lot of positive change in digital transformation. But it's really hard to teach an old dog new tricks. So I understand that. But yeah, I basically run a cybersecurity company.
Thank you. So, Arjun?
Good afternoon, right? What time is it? I don't know. Whatever. My name's RJ Huskey. I am a virtual CISO, like Lizzo, but I'm not Lizzo. So that's a Chief Information Security Officer. I've had my company for about 3 years. I started HOZHO Cybersecurity when I was in graduate school. We were looking at all these attacks that were going on in different industries, looking at Sony, Home Depot, OPM with the federal government, and one of the things that really caught my attention as a Navajo and Hopi was that the whole dialogue around cybersecurity in tribal communities was just non-existent. So I found that really troubling, and to the point where I remember getting really upset, and I was like, why aren't we doing more in this? Why aren't people helping? And I was like, well, duh. That's why you were, blessed to go to graduate school. It's, you're here to learn and to take this back to your community. So that's when I decided to open up the company, and this is a very, it's a field that can be really lucrative. There's a lot of attention on it, but I deliberately have placed myself into the tribal community, and so that's what I do. I'm a service provider doing cybersecurity with tribal governments. So I work with an entity on the Navajo Nation. I have some school districts, and I also have a client up in Alaska. And Gerty is actually one of my business partners. We actually are a really good team together because I'm on the governance leadership side, working with the frameworks, all the regulatory stuff. I fight with lawyers like these two here all the time. Only joking. And then Gerty's on the technical side, so we end up being a really good team, and because we tend to talk the same language, and we really have the same goal in trying to secure our communities. So one of the things that is really interesting is when I was starting my business, I was, looking for clients to do business with, and it's really interesting, even as an Indigenous person, the door is still closed coming into the market. But I was fortunate that my current client, they had just talked to their insurance carrier the day I showed up, and the insurance company told them that they needed to implement cybersecurity controls. So I show up and they're like, wow, you're speaking the same language. We don't know what this is about, but you seem to have the solution. And so they decided to move forward, and I've been working with them for about 2.5 years now. And although they don't understand cybersecurity, they really have leaned on me for my experience, my expertise in this area. Cybersecurity is a field where you don't just fall into it. You have to go through training to do this type of work, because there's a lot on the line. And I Compared that to another client who, this past 4th of July, I was literally celebrating 4th of July out in the public, talking about some of these cyber threats and things that can happen in tribal communities. And, you know, hearing from elders, you know, all their different examples of like their access being hacked, Medicare, Social Security, banking, you know, it's really kind of heartbreaking. You hear all these stories, but then I start getting back-to-back calls. I'm like, what the heck is going on? And it's my other client who 1 week before 4th of July, they had a big fight with the tribal council around cybersecurity funding, utilizing some of their ARPA funds, and they decided not to fund it. And 1 week later, they got hit. And so in my line of work, I don't like to be in that position where I'm telling you, I told you so, but it's one of those, I told you so. You know, one client leaned in, said, we don't really know what this is about, but, you know, we're gonna trust you to do your job. And then the other client that took the other route. So now they have a lot of cleanup to do. You know, the thing that is really heartbreaking about this is that at the end of the day, the governments are going to be fine. You know, they're governments, they have insurance and they get funding. They have means to bring back in some of those lost funds, but it's tribal member data that's caught up in these breaches. What's not talked about is really that emotional impact that happens to individuals. On the extreme side, we have seen through research that people have committed suicide as a result of their data being attacked. Others have just completely given up. The last figures I was looking at for elders, it was around, I believe, like $1,300 to get an elder's data cleaned up, and it can take up to 3 to 5 years, I believe. And for youth, it was around $1,500 and in a similar time frame. And when I look at that, you know, in the city of Phoenix, you know, that type of money's readily available, but in a tribal community, a dollar goes a long way. And I think of someone like me who grew up on the reservation and, you know, was destined for college. And if I found out that my data was hacked and I couldn't get a job, I couldn't get loans, I would be in a completely different situation right now. And that's really the reality I bring back to the tribal leaders, that we need to do more to protect our community. And as school district, as governing board members, they need to do things to update their policies to protect our community members. Unfortunately, every time I go out to the reservations, I hear of more and more breaches. A lot of these things are really just cleaned up. And it kind of goes back to the heart of what both Trevor and Tyson were talking about, is just the lack of this regulatory framework, and there are no protections in place. I criticize this area in data sovereignty because I think we care about it. There's a lot of attention on it in spirit, but I don't see the conversation happening in terms of like regulatory framework. And I'm talking something similar to like the GDPR that we have in Europe, or even the CCPA out in California. So that's kind of what I have to say on that, and I'm going to turn it back over to the other folks here.
Marissa, do you want to chime in on the conversation and introduce yourself?
Okay. So I'm an associate professor here. My name is Marisa Duarte at the School of Social Transformation. And when you get tenure, you don't crash weddings, you crash conference panels.
We welcome your crash.
So RJ, I can't quite remember how we met. I think I introduced myself to you at an Indigenous Peoples Day event. Yeah, because I'm a nerd about infrastructure. I'm a librarian first, and I did my degree in information science. But when I was studying information, I was trying to think, what is the #1 way that we could get tribes, like sovereign native nations, to sort of have some measure of control and efficacy and environment, which I was in Seattle. So, you know, there's Seattle, there's Palo Alto, right? There's these places, there's Boston, there's these places where innovations, tech innovations really flourished. Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech, there are these hubs. And then I'm thinking of some place like Navajo Nation or Pascoyaki or someplace in Mexico, you know. And I realized the answer was infrastructure, that if a tribe has command of an infrastructure, an information infrastructure, then they can begin to assert regulation, and they can begin to basically do the controls that another country has over their infrastructure. And so I wrote a book called Network Sovereignty, which specifically looks at tribes who are building out their own internet infrastructure for precisely that reasons, because they want the economic benefit, educational capacity, they want to forward the work of small business, put their stuff online so people know where the nation is at, all of that. But attendant to that are these issues of cybersecurity, which I, right on, early on when I was doing that research and talking with tribes who were building out their own, this was the primary problem. And the reason why wasn't only because of, needing to protect employee data or the data of tribal citizens or something like that. It was also because they knew that if they didn't have command over the infrastructure, all other infrastructure is weakened because it's based on that network backbone, that internet backbone. So for example, if your internet backbone is hacked, your network is hacked, and yet all of your employees are using, like, they're plugging into their phones and they're relying on wireless, right, to take phone calls, they might not get that emergency dispatch that's needed, in a case of a very serious situation happening on the reservation. They could also see this in situations which we went through before it happened. Different tribes could see this with a situation which we went through, which was COVID, right? Which was that if your network shuts down or you don't have wireless in particular regions where there's families living, they're just out of communication, and what do you do about schooling? What do you do about health? What do you do about basic public advisory? And so I could see that tribes were already thinking of that, and that was why they were building out their internet, because they already saw those weaknesses. And the ones who really were doing it were the ones who were the gaming tribes. They had the investment to go ahead and do that, but they were also, because of the gaming experience, they understood the need to maintain a secure environment, because gaming introduces all kinds of vulnerabilities in various ways. So that's really important, and I agree with RJ about, I'm saying this with deference to, because we have the public health folks speaking later, right? Indigenous data sovereignty is super important for our public health researchers, because the idea is that, tribes need to have control of the data sets. There's in the research world, there's data, and then there's data sets. These are two different phenomena, okay? Even though they have the word data, which is super confusing. So data sets are a discrete body of information that is curated and collected with a very compelling methodology in mind, which can arguably be contained and answer a line of inquiry. It helps answer a problem. But data in our world, if you're like doing technical innovation, it's continuous. It's all around you. It can't be just kind of put into a lockbox. It would be, an example would be like here at ASU, I work here, I don't really have to worry about my cybersecurity so much, only because the university is so good at protecting it. We have technology enterprise, we have all of that, right? So when I have a data set and I need to keep it in a server, it's all set up. I don't need to worry about it. I can trust that they're going to do a good job of protecting that information, and I can therefore assert to my research partners it's secure, it's protected, right? But if you're doing research, and you're like a nonprofit and you don't have that set up, you can't really offer that guarantee, and this is a really key component when we're talking about giving data sets back to Native nations. Do they have that set up? And I'm really glad that Alex Soto, my colleague, the librarian, Ton Autumn librarian, brings this up, because that's precisely the conversations that librarians and archivists need to think about when they're thinking of transferring or doing repatriation projects. Does the tribal library or the tribal museum or research center have a setup so that that information that's being transferred is actually secure and stable and going to be there for future generations? So that's what I appreciate about this conversation. And I am also very thankful for Professor Reed's notes about, well, what about, the manufacturing of Indigenous identity that's happening out there, because then it can help us connect the dots between the nuts and bolts about, like, literally, are we going to pay a CISO? We don't even know I didn't even pronounce it right. CISO, yeah. Are we going to pay the guy we can't even pronounce what he does? Really? Are we going to pay this? How do you make it real is by explaining to folks, like, these are some of the implications. This is the broader ecology of how information knowledge flows in the space. Yes, we are worried about personal information management, personal information protection. However, we also want to introduce a fluency about these other kinds of manufacturing and appropriation, misuse of tribal words, tribal codes, in this particular environment. And that example that you give about the fashion designer is like the most grotesque, but it can happen in like a lesser way, which is like the deep fake, emulating somebody's voice to get into very, for example, IHS information or something like that.
Can I comment on one thing? So one of the things that I do in governance, it's really setting up all the paperwork. When you're implementing a cybersecurity program, policies are the very first thing that you have to implement. I consider it the amino acids of building your program. So my one client, it's literally taking them 2 years to implement their very first set of cybersecurity policies. And I'm saying that just to give you an example of how challenging it is to implement cybersecurity in Indian country. It shouldn't be that hard, but it is extremely difficult to get leaders to change their minds. One, I think they're scared of the technology for some reason, because I'm like, you're carrying around a mobile phone that is basically a mobile computer, but it goes over their heads. The second thing is funding. It always comes back to funding because it is expensive to implement cybersecurity. So what I do is I help them to implement their program based upon federally recognized frameworks like the CIS controls or the NIST cybersecurity framework. We use that really as the framework to push things forward. And in our contracts, it's an area that's really overlooked, I think, particularly when it comes to data, because there is the transference of data. It's also giving the organization the ability to litigate should things go sideways, which they always do. That's why you have contracts. But it's also the protections, because if you're a company or you're an institution, whatever it might be, you're responsible for that network. So if you have somebody that's doing bad things on that network, the regulators are going to come back to you. And so I tell my clients all the time that what we're trying to do is to make sure that you are in a really good position, you have a really good story to tell when that day comes, because in this line of work, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to have that day. And unfortunately, it's coming too soon for a lot of organizations. And the other part of this is that in the state of Arizona, we actually have a really great model with cybersecurity with the Arizona Department of Homeland Security. They received federal funding from the Biden administration, and they implemented this cyber readiness program where they went out to providers like CrowdStrike, Cloudflare, Tanium, and they acquired licenses that they could distribute to the public entities. And these licenses for this security software is actually available to tribal governments should they decide to take advantage of it. So one of the things about CrowdStrike, they were in the news a few months ago because they caused the world to shut down when they released some updates to their code, and it didn't play nice with Microsoft, and so they were in the news for a really bad reason. But CrowdStrike is amazing because CrowdStrike works on these systems where, in one example, we had a really old server that hadn't been updated. It's been sitting in some tribal closet forever, running like Windows Server 2009 or something crazy like that. And we were migrating some data to uplift the operating system. And although this server had antivirus installed on it, there was a Trojan sitting on the server. And the thing about the Trojans is that they masquerade as legitimate files, and they can oftentimes go undetected for months or years. And this type of Trojan, it was actually waiting for an action to be taken before it would release its payload. And when the data started its transference, that's when the Trojan set off. And it went undetected by the local antivirus solution, but CrowdStrike caught it in a split second. And had we not been involved with the state's cybersecurity program, or they had me on board providing that advisement to them of, let's take this forward, that organization would be in a really different situation. Because that type of malware would have spread what we consider laterally, meaning basically it'll infect everything on the network. So anything that that's there connected to the internet. And so we've been able to shut that down. So on the other side is basically what I'm trying to point out with all this AI is that there's a lot of tools that we use to defend companies, and that is just one of the examples. So I wanted to add that in.
All right. What you were talking about just reminded me of something. So there was this tribal enterprise that I was working with a few years ago, and it was so funny because I am the person that goes through and looks at the network. And normally when we first start working with a customer, I have to go into the network closet, inspect all the computers, basically see what they have to see if it needs to be upgraded or downgraded or replaced entirely. And so I was in this building with all of these tribal employees, and I think that a lot of people, I see a bunch of natives in here, so you'll know what I'm talking about, but there was a lot of Tsinnie going around, so there was a lot of gossip going around as I was walking through the building. And I was like, oh, this is so weird. Why are they telling me these things? Like, I shouldn't know this information about the company. And I was like, this is so weird. But they just got so comfortable. So they were just telling me all of these things. And I was like, does your company make you sign an NDA? Like, are you supposed to be like sharing this with me? And I was so confused because they were just willingly spilling all this information. And so then a month goes by, I forget about it, and I'm on Facebook. And I'm on the tribal side of Facebook, so I'm on the native Facebook page. And so I start to see this company that I had worked with, and all of their data was released because their company keeps copies of papers. They don't put it on a server anywhere. So a disgruntled employee had taken tons of the company's files and was sharing it to social media and was blasting the company. So I think that's one of the reasons why I like to recommend to tribes, put your data in the cloud so that you know who took it, when they took it, how they took it, and also make sure that you have agreements in place with your employees to, you know, not share confidential information. So I think the biggest starting point for tribes really is just getting their information into a place where you can track it, you can see who's accessed it, and you can see when it's been downloaded. So tribes are always so funny.
Thank you. No, with limited time, are there any questions from the audience or that we can take from you? Don't be shy. Sure. So if I, is there like a template or model out there for best practices for AI and cybersecurity if I were a tribal business or tribal government and wanted to adopt, sort of skill up for what's coming down the pipeline? Are there templates or best practices out there that I can look to for increasing my cybersecurity?
Absolutely, I'll take that question. So me and my company, we specifically work in Microsoft 365, and that's what our background is in. And so when companies hire me on, I'll typically be an architect or an advisor on their company with their technical team. And so I've done this for around 5 years now, but I've always been in IT for the most part, well over a decade. And so I've basically collected a lot of best practice standards for Microsoft 365, and this year learned that there were so many other service providers like myself who didn't know how to deploy this securely or correctly. And so I took a lot of time this year to develop a best practice guide using some of the frameworks that RJ has mentioned. So CIS, NIST, they're all incorporated into these SOPs that I've created. And so I've actually shared this with multiple service providers across the country and globally. So I've helped over 300 service providers now basically deploy Microsoft 365 securely from scratch. And it's for companies who can't necessarily pay an advisor or a consultant. So if a tribe was interested in, adopting best practices when it comes to Microsoft 365, they could just go to my website, purchase our guide, and do it from scratch. It's proven, it's tested, and it helps you to audit all of the places and remediate those gaps so that your company is more secure. And it also allows you to make sure that you're using or you're making the most of your investments for the most part. So Microsoft has a lot of great resources, but ours are tailored and we give you all of the ingredients basically.
Great, thank you for that. So we have some questions on the screen from the audience. So one question is, how do you get cybersecurity? Would cybersecurity be included?
Okay. All right. Now I have to use the microphone. Little refresher, everything is on this board, so it tells you what the minimum wage is. You can't go below $10 because again, that's illegal and your employees will sue you.
I think we got
This
hacked.
is the start of your company.
Oops, oh well.
Okay.
It can happen to us.
Okay, we do have one question here in the audience.
Yes, the question I have is maybe part of it is cybersecurity, but also in terms of the work that you do in the field is that when we came out of the pandemic, there were other activities within the university to really kind of do a look back in terms of how did we respond, mainly from a public health perspective and how health systems operated in response to the pandemic, and especially in rural communities and tribal communities. And so the panels that were presented to more of a tech group was, and this was tech that was far beyond my comprehension, but first to some county providers, epidemiologists, others that were really kind of had some sense of how the system responded. And then we had a set of tribal health providers. And it was really interesting in the tribal health discussion is what came up in that conversation was Indian Health Service from a medical records perspective is to a certain degree, and again, I don't want to create something that isn't, is more secondhand information, but based on RPMS, and the RPMS system with Indian Health Service is DAWS based. So they said that they don't even have programmers that are still around. I mean, it's harder to find programmers that can even do DAWS-based programming. And so, in your experience, it isn't just tribal government, but it's also those agencies that work with tribes, whether it's cadastral services, realty, or healthcare delivery. Do you have any observation or experience in terms of where these non-tribal entities that are working with tribes and the risk that they have in also storing and maintaining tribal information and data?
Yeah, so one of the school districts on Navajo that I've been working with, they told me that when the pandemic happened that they had to shift from in-person learning to online learning, and a lot of their students are in rural country. So they worked with, I believe, NTUA to set up Wi-Fi hotspots for the students, and the school board went out and acquired over 100 iPads as they thought it would help the students with their learning. The thing is, they were acting really in response, kind of in emergency mode, and all those devices were never even enrolled into any type of management software. So they had lots of problems, students looking at porn, students violence, all the gossip, I mean, all sorts of problems. And then the devices were coming back broken. Some of them were just walking out the door. And so when we were just adding up the cost, and it was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses for a school district. Which, our schools are in pretty bad shape, and so it just really breaks my heart, Like I go out there and it's like, wow, the school district only has one person to do everything. They're doing the phones, they're doing the lights, they're doing cybersecurity, and they're really overwhelmed. But the heart of it, what I wanted to, I guess, comment on it is, but I wanted to give that example is that cybersecurity really is an individual responsibility. The governments aren't going to do cybersecurity for you. So we have an obligation in our own homes to protect ourselves. You should have antivirus on your mobile phones, get it on your iPads. Some of the carriers like Cox, Verizon offer cybersecurity solutions that you can buy for like $5 a month or whatever. Buy it. You should also think about your home networks of acquiring a firewall that you can protect your home network. We have seen situations where there has been some, I guess, responsibility that's directed back to employees that are working from home. If they cause an outbreak in that situation, somebody on the network, like a kid, bringing in a virus and then it jumps and then it gets into the corporate environment. We've seen situations where companies are taking some actions against that. So the firewalls can, I won't say prevent, but they can weed out a lot of that and put you into a better position. And also for small businesses, I mean, even if your business is on Square or Etsy, whatever, get a firewall. They're not expensive, and work with a provider like myself or Gerty to get those configured. And these types of systems need to be updated. If you're walking around and your phone has a bunch of those little red dots indicating you haven't updated your phone, you're probably already in a bad position to start with. So keep everything updated. Turn on your auto updates. Yeah, and that's all I will comment on there.
So a few things to add to that. I think the problem with AI is that so far most cybersecurity threats are like viruses, computer code that come through your phone and grab your data or mess with your data or steal your contact list or something like that. What we're going to start seeing now is that computers are going to imitate humans. Humans, and they're going to come at you not through code that's going to infect your computer. They're going to call you up, have a Zoom call, and be like, "Hey, RJ, it's great we're working on this. We need a payment from you. Can you please send it to this Hong Kong bank account?" I know that's a little strange, but we bank through Hong Kong. We've done it for years. And so you need to be careful about how these attacks are going to come at you. And I'm not just talking about this, academically for your tribal governments or businesses, but to each of you individually. It only takes about 3 seconds of audio to replicate a person's voice with about 90% accuracy. So you've got more than enough material on me, any of us up here today, to replicate any of our voices. If you've been videotaping us, you can replicate our images in high definition and put that out there with the right software. And so if anybody's asking you for money, don't start giving your accounts or start doing things. Think of a secondary, we have these like two-factor authentications. Think of a two-factor authentication for people in your life. If your mom or tribal chairman calls you up saying, "Hey, we need a $500 gift card," be like, "Okay, let me verify that through our email, or let me call you back on your number that I have in my contact list," because now there's different software out there where they can spoof what appears to be like maybe your phone number, but it's really coming from somewhere else, and it only appears to be your phone number and caller ID. And really all of this comes down to education. We need to talk about these examples where these people got scammed. A friend of mine just got scammed. He was working for a construction company, and he thought his manager told him to buy $500 gift cards to give out to everybody, which he thought was a lot, but it's like, okay, did it. So he went out and bought the cards, came back. He's like, "Well, I've got like 30 of these $500 gift cards, but what do you want me to do with them?" And his manager was like, "What the hell did you do? I didn't tell you to do that." And fortunately, fortunately for the company, they kept the money and they didn't get scammed. But my friend did get fired because their manager, the company, thought they should have known better. And so I think all of these cybersecurity attacks are going to seem way more personal, as opposed to just getting an email from 20 years ago. If you remember the Nigerian prince who was locked up and needed some money on email, now it's going to be your friend, your manager, somebody who needs that money, and it's going to seem real, like, "Oh my God, here's a walking, talking version of my friend RJ. He's stuck somewhere, needs $500 to fix his tires or something. Sure, I'd do that. He's my friend. I'd give him $500 to help him out, but it's probably not really RJ." And so you want to check that stuff.
Okay, we do have a question here. So we have like about 5 minutes. So there is a question here. So let me ask a question from our online folks. How can concerns about data sovereignty and sharing between tribes and healthcare institutions be addressed, particularly in navigating HIPAA regulations while ensuring effective data use, promoting transparency, improving communication, and simplifying data sharing processes that protect tribal privacy?
I'll take that one. So I think that the biggest thing to do when navigating data sovereignty and regulations like HIPAA is to understand where the data is being stored. So having a really good data labeling process is going to help you to track that data as it's being distributed and making sure that you're only securing it in secure locations and that only certain people that need to access that information are accessing that information, and also informing your users or your employees on what they can and cannot share and being deliberate about tracking that information. So recording phone calls, making sure that you're doing QA on those phone calls to make sure that the patient's data is protected. But also with Microsoft 365, don't want to plug it again, but you can create different types of data labeling policies that will automatically encrypt the data as it's being processed. And there's an auto labeling feature where it will do it for you automatically. That one's a little bit more dangerous, but you can basically scope and target what you're going to encrypt and how it's going to be encrypted, who can access it, when they can access it, and then you'll also be able to track that information as it's processed. So I think when it comes to data sovereignty in that context, the biggest thing is making sure that everyone understands what data sovereignty means, because I've worked with a few tribes and enterprises on the reservation, and this is going to kind of answer the gentleman's question over here, who were very adamant that because they were tribal organizations or tribal entities, that they didn't have to comply with cybersecurity. They said, I'm a sovereign nation, I don't need to do that, which really isn't true. If you want to have a business and do these things in a certain sector, you need to make sure that you're following the compliance regulations and the frameworks that align with it. So I normally tell businesses to look up the FTC safeguards. They have a really good checklist of cybersecurity best practices that you can follow, and it's free. So if you're not sure if you're doing cybersecurity in your company, you're not sure if your IT guy is doing it, most IT guys aren't, you need to look that up. So look up the FTC safeguards. There's a free PDF. There's, I think, 25 things on it that say what you can do to be cyber secure.
Do any of the panelists also want to address that?
Actually, Trevor, can you comment on this, like on the litigation? Like, what are the risks to tribal entities? Like, what federal laws, private rights of action apply?
All right, so we're talking about a scenario where you have a tribe that's decided not to take reasonable action, right, to protect their data. So, you know, one of the most important areas of intellectual property that we don't talk much about is called trade secrets. And trade secrets are essentially an area of information, data that you might have that gives you a competitive advantage over others. And as long as you take reasonable efforts to keep it secret, you're able to protect it in various ways, right? You're able to protect it from illicit appropriations, things like that. I think a lot of the data that we keep in our businesses could potentially qualify as a trade secret. But if we don't take those reasonable measures, right? If we don't do the things that are the industry standards, I don't know, that's kind of a hard argument to say, hey, you know, Mr. Judge or Mrs. Judge, I want to argue that I've got a trade secret here, but you know, I haven't bothered to take any action to protect it. We just put it out there, and our servers are out of date, and you know, we post stuff on social media, and we share it as gossip within our office. So you know, of course, and so I think that's one thing to keep in mind, right? We need to keep up with whatever the industry standard is if we want to be able to protect our work in these ways. You know, when it comes to copyright, I think that's another area that we sometimes forget. You know, we're posting things to social media thinking, hey, you know, I own this, and even Facebook and Instagram tell us that we own the rights, but when you post it, you give this massive license to everybody who uses Facebook to go ahead and use it for any purpose anywhere in the world, and we give them that permission in advance. Right, so I think we need to also be careful about using social media, right? It's much harder to try to get that stuff back once we've already posted, and once it's already out there in the world, it makes it much more challenging to be able to claim, you know, absolute ownership over something. But was there like a more specific scenario you wanted to talk about, or?
I was just curious because I've actually heard the same as Gerty with tribes saying, we don't need to do cybersecurity because we're sovereign.
Oh, okay.
And
the sovereignty piece, yeah.
Yeah, my take is aligned with Gerty, where I'm like, I don't really buy that because you still have federal oversight. FTC, I talked to regulators at the FTC, at SEC, like some of these big agencies, and they still have jurisdiction. In fact, I even talked to one of the FBI officers in the Phoenix field office, and I was like, "What do you think about this?" And they're like, "Nah, we still have we still have oversight." Yeah, so like some of this comes back to, I believe it was the oh my gosh, what is the regulation dealing with federal computer crimes, and they can enforce through that mechanism. I forget the name of the law, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, yes, a tribe is sovereign, right? And so, you know, maybe they don't necessarily have to do it as a matter of just kind of operation on their own. They aren't required to require all of their servers to be, you know, in compliance unless there's a federal law that they've agreed to that they're going to comply with. But you know, is that good practice, right? Is that worthwhile? And is somebody going to be willing to give you funding if you don't meet those basic requirements, right? Does that jeopardize your federal grants if you aren't keeping your servers up to date? Now, on the flip side, you could certainly set standards that are higher than the industry standard, and I think that's where tribes could excel, right? We could be innovators in making sure that our areas are protected to a degree that states and federal government aren't currently acting right now, right? We can be ahead of the ball, ahead of the game, and I think that's probably where we can be. We can move a lot faster than other governments can. Marisa, you want to add anything? Or?
No, I just want, and thank you for bringing that up, because that's a major theme that we failed to, it's known, but we failed to point it out, is that this is a matter of national security, and that you don't have sovereignty unless you exercise it, especially in an international scenario where we have what are called foreign adversaries or bad actors, to borrow from the national security language, who are specifically looking for infrastructural vulnerabilities in this country, the United States. And a lot of times those are our nations. And this is a known thing for people who are working in the tech environment in those spaces, because they deal with it all the time. You can see where the breaches are coming from. They're coming from Korea, they're coming from China, they're coming from Russia or something. They can trace that, right, through a lot of the suite of tools that RJ and Gerty are referring to. And so I'm really thankful for what Professor Reed is talking about, because as tribal people, we still have to think about balancing our rights to creativity and our creative expressions and preserving our knowledge and reclaiming our languages, but we need to think about national security too. And that's a conversation not just for us, but it happens with the activists, it's happening with the educators, you know, so it is like a very broad education that, you know, frankly, we're still kind of just testing the ground on. And that's why I like this last question about like try to be responsible with HIPAA. Frankly, you know, this is where I want to, maybe we need to bring in more of our native thinkers in STEM, is that we do need to promote more spaces for innovation so we can write about this and research these case studies and discuss it and make it known, because so far it's tacit knowledge among practitioners, attorneys, you know, small business, people who've gone through it, and then it's not passed on. Maybe like in a hallway conversation at Res or at NIGA or something, but it's just not passed on as an actual science, as something that can be potentially codified and carried into regulatory practice.
I hate to cut this conversation short, but we're getting into the time for the next panel that's coming up for lunch. So I really want to thank each of you. So each of you will have to Venmo me some like $100 or something. So again, let's congratulate the panel for a wonderful discussion here.
Such an interesting conversation, and you know, for those of you that have attended doing research in indigenous communities, year over year, it always changes, and part of that is because things change, and we also recognize the importance of what tribes need to be aware of, and the tribal communities that we work with. You know, we say research, but there's so much more to, you know, capacity building and really protecting our tribal nations and communities. You know, besides my day job as vice president at ASU, I also serve as the chairman of the board for the management board for Desert Diamond Casinos. Not making a pitch here, but you know, we have 2 properties in Tucson, one here in Phoenix, getting ready to open a second one here in the Phoenix area, one in HOZHO. And this conversation came up through our Policy Institute, who also is going into a collaboration with NCAI on digital sovereignty, which is the umbrella that also includes data sovereignty and all other forms of kind of data-driven sovereignty, and what does that mean? And in the process of that conversation, you know, the suggestion was, well, tribes are not there yet. they're not looking into this. And I said, not really. I mean, they are. It just depends on where. Because if you look at the casino operations, they clearly are, far, far much further ahead. And in really interesting ways, just this, in the last compacts that were negotiated a couple of years ago was sports betting. So sports betting that has also opened up to the to franchise, to the professional sports franchise from, Cardinals, Diamondbacks, Phoenix Suns also have some form of sports betting. The trade-off was that tribes would also get that as well. And what tribes, received was not only the ability to compete, outside of their boundaries, but also a separate entity within their boundaries. So there's technically 2 licenses for tribes around sports betting. So it's really interesting because, we have this geocache, geofencing, where only the sports betting that's done within the boundaries of the reservation is one entity, and then tribes have another entity that is statewide, but those systems only function up to the state boundary. So if you're in Nevada, you can't do Arizona sports betting, and you also can't do the tribal licensed sports betting, but you can do that within the boundaries. And so all of that comes with a lot of complexity and technology and risk, given the potential for millions of dollars. And this is tribal money. This is money that is going back to the tribal nations to support education, healthcare, taking care of our elders. And so there is some pretty deep infrastructure that's happening. It's just a matter of how do you channel that over to healthcare or to education or to cultural patrimony within our communities. And so it's always, important to recognize, where the work is happening and how do we leverage that, so that we can benefit that in other spaces. Just the last of my closing comments is that before we break for lunch, because we'll give you time to grab lunch and then get settled, and then we'll jump into a plenary panel for lunch, which will probably start around 12:15, maybe around 12:20, is that part of what attracted me to come to ASU is that really the technology, I have to admit, the bells and whistles in terms of how this can really support our communities. Having been a former banker, a degree in finance, going out to tribal communities really to, provide what experience I had in helping tribal nations and communities, and then ended up in the president's office at Salt River Pima Maricopa as a chief of staff and intergovernmental affairs, as it gave me an opportunity to kind of see the broad sense of what tribes are doing, Salt River in particular, but in healthcare, education, social services, juvenile justice, environmental, tribal leaders are dealing with all of it, all at one time, and so there's this kind of running joke that, well, you invite them to the meeting, but they can't be there, but the fact of the matter is that they're also invited to 4 other meetings at the same time. So it's a matter of how do they manage their time and their resources. And so a lot of my work was really around policy, because when the president that I worked for left, he eventually talked me into joining him on the consulting side. So we were consulting with tribes on a variety of topics, not just here in the United States, but in Canada and other places. And ASU was actually one of our clients before they talked me into coming in here full time. And coming here was, I went to school to go work for tribes, and it's like, well, now what am I doing at a university? But for me, it was really understanding that a lot of the work that we do, for those of us who are in the older generations, a lot of times it's putting together a report, or even the PowerPoint we turn over to a young person to help create it for us. And now they're creating websites for us, or they're doing ChatGPT, to help us advance the work. The fact of the matter is that we are visual learners, very tactile in terms of how we understand. And so the things around virtual reality, XR, VR, these are really the kinds of things that are going to benefit our communities, but also need those kinds of protections to ensure that bad actors, don't appropriate, which we know has always been part of the history as appropriation. So how do we protect that? So great conversation this morning, great set of panelists. We're not done yet. We'll talk about healthcare as one of the afternoon sessions. We've also got language preservation, Again, continuation on the immersive experience that's available in the turquoise room. That is a breakout session of the 3 that are available this afternoon. And during lunch, we will, I think a really important topic is around tribal IRB. IRB is central to a lot of what we do in terms of research, and therefore makes sense that this should be a topic for this particular conference. So again, let's give all of our speakers another round of applause. Thank yourself for being here.